Hi everybody, and a really warm welcome to the latest episode of our Geostrategy in Action series. For those who don't know me, I'm Ollie Jones and I lead EY Parthenon's Geostrategic Business Group globally. For those who have listened to one of these episodes before, you're very warmly welcome back. And for those of you new to the episodes, great to have you. So we take different topics each time, and we've talked recently about the impact of geopolitics on sustainability, the impact on geopolitics on government. Today, we're looking at the impacts on transaction, and particularly on the transactions market. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by our chief transactions market watcher, I'm going to describe him as, so Barry Perkins. So Barry, a really warm welcome to this video cast.
Thanks, Holly. Really pleased to be here. Hi, everybody. I'm actually the lead analyst or a lead analyst in our business and CXO Insights group within EY. But my main focus, as Ollie says, is really looking at investment flows with a particular attention to M&A. And really, it has to be said, geopolitics is a big part of this story now.
And so, Barry, thank you again. You're really warmly welcome. And so let's go precisely to that point. So viewers of this video cast know well that the geopolitics is in a very interesting and very dynamic and very uncertain space. They also know that this is not just the last 3 months. It's been the last, probably, you could argue, almost 10 years or so. And so we really want to ask this question, like, what does this mean for this transactions market in different places around the world, in different sectors and so on and so forth? Now, I guess the simplistic view would be to say all this uncertainty makes people less certain about their choices and maybe damages the transaction market. But give us your perspective on that, both in terms of what it looks like right now, but also what it has been like for the last few years as well.
Well, if we look at a broad transactions market and we look at the current state, then 2025 hasn't actually been that bad. We've just sort of crunched the numbers on the first half of this year, and there's been 2.1 trillion of deals announced. Which probably was what we were expecting at the start of the year. We thought there would be a healthy year of deal making after a slow 23 and a gradual pickup through 24. Obviously, that got impacted by the increasing concerns around the impact of tariff and trade. But strangely enough, we've seen a strong rebound after a slow April. We've seen a strong May and then a strong June. So the transaction market is not bad at the moment. Putting that in the context of the longer term view, and especially with a focus on cross-border, we can actually see the impact of geopolitics and tensions between countries. If we go back to 2007, cross-border made up 40% of global M&A. That's gradually trimmed down over the years, and it was averaging about 30% of M&A up to the point of the pandemic. Now, in 2025, we actually see that just a quarter of deals by value are cross-border. So there has been a pullback in terms of the amount of deals that are being done that are cross-border. It does have some areas that you can call out. Obviously, China pulling out of cross-border both through choice and through restrictions placed on Chinese acquirers by other countries. That's had a big impact. But even in those areas where you would expect to see more cross-border, we haven't seen that being sustained. The only relationship in terms of cross-border that you can say has really thrived during that whole period is between the US and the UK. And that's both inbound into the US and outbound from the US into the UK. So it shows that the relationships between countries does have a big impact in supporting the environment for cross-border deals to be done. Now taking that looking forward, I think the direction of travel will be that there will be fewer cross-border deals that go across continents. We may see more cross-border deals being done within particular regions, but we can come to those later. But it is true that we have seen this gradual erosion of the ability for cross-border deals, especially large, complex, global cross-border deals, to get done.
And so, Barry, just take you back to where you started. So your perspective is that in sense of overall numbers and overall deal value, the impact on the transaction market is perhaps less than sometimes you hear on commentary or sometimes you might expect given the levels of uncertainty. But what you're arguing is that it's the patterns of transactions that have changed more as a result of geopolitics. And I think that's a really interesting conclusion. And I'm going to kind of just pull at that second thread then, right? But I wanted to sort of just note that first thread, which is actually it's not such an impact on sort of volumes as perhaps people might think. But putting on the second thread, you mentioned obviously less cross-border transactions, and so what's the balance between that bit? What's driving that, right? What in terms of the balance between, is this a sort of investment control and a kind of government regulation of actual individual transactions type issue? Or is it more to do with the fact that in a world where supply chains are more complicated, where it's harder to move things around, it's just less attractive to do those deals, even if governments would be fine with the deals, it's just commercially less attractive. Now, I'm assuming it's a bit of both, but what are you sort of seeing and what else is driving this, do you think, when you scratch below the surface?
I think it is a bit of both. I think one of the key drivers and the reasons for fewer larger deals being done, especially, is the attitude of governments around the world. And we have to say, this isn't just a US specific issue. It is an issue that many governments and supranational blocs like the EU have increasingly voiced concerns about cross-border M&A, especially inbound M&A. That's where it all started. Scrutiny of deals, especially in the most sensitive areas, has increased, and there's been an expansion of the number of sectors that are deemed sensitive. So you have that aspect of it, and it creates an environment where acquirers are really thinking, and again, especially for the big, complex global deals that are relevant to many regulatory authorities, these deals take a lot of time to structure, and the regulatory process has become more burdensome. So therefore, companies are probably more hesitant to go after a deal unless they're 100% certain that it will go through. They don't want to spend 18 months focusing on a deal that eventually gets sort of pushed over by one of the major regulators.
So that's a big driver, and then presumably the second driver is that some of these deals are just commercially less attractive if it's going to be harder to move goods and other things across borders, basically, and that's also obviously a driver too.
Yeah, no, exactly, and we know that companies are deeply investigating their supply chains at the moment, trying to make sure that they operate as optimally as possible within the constraints of the environment we see evolving. They don't want to take on those extra headaches of bringing in new supplier relationships, having to understand their vulnerabilities to a changing trade and tariff environment. They'll probably put those ones off. We've heard from a lot of clients, and it's something that actually came out in our recent CEO survey. 85% of respondents said that they had changed their investment stance because of the geopolitical tensions that they see in the marketplace. And 54% said that they'd actually paused an investment to wait to see where the environment lands. 20% had said that they'd actually stopped an investment. So it is something that really is, again, weighing on top of those extra concerns about the regulatory, about government stance, etc. It's an extra complication that acquirers don't want to take on board at the moment.
And look, that's really interesting. And one of the things we like to do on this video cast is look at risk and opportunities, right? And suppose clearly that, you've articulated why this is more difficult and it's driving certain behaviours. But it would be interesting to think, for us all to reflect. And you don't need to answer this question. Like, there are opportunities here for those people who feel that they're confident in navigating the regulatory sort of environment, or those people who feel more confident about navigating the kind of international headwinds. Then presumably it follows that there are some opportunities out there for those who are who feel confident and feel ready to be brave. But I wanted to you mentioned a few sort of pairs of cross-border trade that was happening. Just a quick question. So in terms of sort of overall deal volumes, are there any particular geographies where things are holding up much more strongly, or indeed the market that's hot, and any particular geographies conversely where we are seeing things that are sort of are being dampened down? Is there a geographic pattern out there?
There is. The long-term pattern really, and again, it goes back to geopolitics, is that that complete breakdown in investment flows between China and the US. That's not going to come back anytime soon. Opposite of that is the strong relationship between the UK and the US. But it's really it's the UK, the rest of Western Europe and the US is where we've seen a more resilience in those cross-border trade flows. Hopefully that will sustain itself because it is an incredibly important part not only of cross-border M&A, but it's an important part of the overall M&A environment itself. And there can be, as you said, there are headwinds, but there are also tailwinds. There are opportunities here. And I think one of the really interesting stories that we're seeing developing at the moment is the change in attitude by the European Union, by the Commission towards supporting consolidation across Europe in particular sectors. We've seen 3 reports come out over the past year. You've got the letter analysis, you've got the Draghi report. There's a recent report on the technology industry, and they all point in the same direction as to Europe needs to be more accommodative towards cross-border M&A in order to get that consolidation within sectors to build the scale that they know they need to compete against the US and China. So I think we will begin to see that pick up in Europe, and that's the one that I think should be an area of focus going forward.
Yeah, really interesting. It's not a one-way street, the kind of regulatory piece that's also, as you say, becoming more permissive in certain circumstances. And a last question for me, you began to talk about sectors, and obviously the number of sectors that are strategic and are affected has been kind of growing across the board here. But I wanted to ask you a more general question. So you've talked through the sort of the geographical patterns of transactions. What's the sector story here? Again, what are the where are you seeing lots of activity? Where are you seeing less activity? Is there much of a what is that sector story?
Well, if we look at the sectors that historically have not really enabled cross-border M&A, then the one that you point towards is the defence sector. If we say that broadly the average of cross-border M&A as a share of global M&A was 30%, in the defence sector it was only 15%, and even that limited trade flow of cross-border M&A in the defence sector was really just focused on 2 countries. Again, it was the US and the UK. So that's the most extreme example. The one area where we do see a lot of cross-border deals, and especially global deals, is obviously consumer. That's one where there tends to be less concern, but we do see other sectors being brought under that umbrella of strategically important, especially in terms of industrial sovereignty. So you can expect to see high-end technology that's already been sort of brought under that umbrella. Other forms of technology will gradually be sort of incorporated under that sort of sensitive area, but then that probably goes down to industrials, and it will go down to life sciences. We've already seen some aspects of that, and the current negotiating tactics of the US government have really focused in on those sector-specific tariffs, and they're the ones where they are talking about life sciences and industrials and metals, etc. The one that actually has always been an oddity, an outlier, is the energy sector, because the energy sector is the one industry where traditionally we did talk about geopolitical risk in terms of investment, because they tended to be investing in countries that were less politically stable. Now, that deal making has still gone on, and it's probably the industry that understood best the nature of geopolitical risk and how to incorporate that into investment strategies. And so we'll begin to see that spread out across those other sectors. In some cases, it will stop deals, but in other cases, it may actually prompt consolidations, especially as in the C-suite and CEOs begin to understand better the nature of geopolitical risk, how it's evolving, and where those opportunities are opening up.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So there's a regional story, there's a geographical story, and there is also a sector story. And perhaps I think we've got time for just a quick answer on this. But the other sort of factor here, right, is, and you've hinted at this, is that governments are seeking to attract in investment. They want technology, they want capability, they want security of supply, they want jobs onshore. So just tell us a little bit about how you see that and how that's affecting, I guess, the sort of transactions market.
This is an interesting part of the environment we're in at the moment, that governments are saying that they want to attract investment, and yet at the same time they are putting up barriers to particular types of deals. And it's not only inbound investments. Governments are increasingly policing outbound investments as well. So governments are creating an environment where deals are less easy to be done. But as you say, they want to attract investment into their own country. So governments around the world need to think about a sort of joined up policy that really does encourage the investment they want to happen. It can't always be stick. There has to be a lot of carrot there. I think that the US has, been on an interesting journey over the past couple of years, because if we think under the Biden administration with the Jobs Act and the CHIPS Act, they were both set up to actually attract inbound investment in particular areas. That was working. And yet when we see a sort of reversal of this, yet the desire of the current US administration to attract more investment into the country, especially building factories in automotive, in chips, in life sciences, etc., is still there. So governments have to find that correct balance of being able to police the M&A market to suit their national interests, and yet still be accommodative enough to make sure that they attract that investment that they say they want.
Yeah. Yeah, terrific. Really interesting. And I think that we'd love to have you back in 6 months or so to revisit this market and see what's happened. But look, thank you for that. It's really helpful. And I think, for me, the messages here are one that, yes, this is an uncertain environment. And of course, that affects the nature of deals and people's appetite for deals. But I think, you've argued quite powerfully that in terms of overall numbers, the impact is not perhaps as big as people might suspect or might be making out. But there's some really interesting regional trends and really interesting sector trends within this as well, and the sort of the role of government is sort of more important in this world than it has been for many years now. So Barry, thank you again for joining us. Really interesting to get your perspective on this market. So Barry, many thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Ollie. Enjoyed myself.
Very good. And thanks to all those who've been watching. Any feedback, of course, welcome, and keep a lookout for new episodes of Geostrategy in Action. There'll be more coming soon. So thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.